Welcome back to Quarks and Quarternotes. Today we will be continuing our previous discussion on thought experiments. If you enjoy the show and would like to show your support, you can subscribe and hit the notification bell, as well as leave a comment with your thoughts, questions, and feedback. So let's get right into it. This first one is one of Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno was a Greek philosopher, I believe. And Tyler, have you ever been to New York?
I have not been to New York.
Well, if you were to go to New York, surely you would need to concede the fact that at some point you would need to go halfway to New York.
Right.
And before you can get halfway to New York, you have to get a quarter of the way to New York.
Right.
Of course, you can just continue this process and we go down to an eighth and a 16th, and it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And Zeno's conclusion was that all of movement is an illusion because it's impossible.
So if I move a half and then I move a quarter of that distance, I will never make it to the end quite, because I always have to move a little bit more.
The way of saying that in a really straightforward way is that you can divide finite space an infinite amount of times, and it's impossible to travel infinite distance.
I don't think he was aware of calculus at the time.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting paradox because intuitively there's nowhere where you can really make an objection. You can't really make an objection to that you have to go half and that you have to go a quarter. So to make an objection against all of it, just saying, oh, well, clearly we move, so movement happens, it's hard one to justify before you have the mathematical tools.
Right, or even understandings of, like, infinity. I feel like infinity took mathematicians and philosophers, like, forever to figure out, it seems.
So clearly we move around, and clearly Zeno's argument is sound. All of the premises are correct, and he has a deductive conclusion that motion is an illusion just because it doesn't work if you accept all the other premises. So there are a couple ways you can reject it. The first intuition is to say that we actually move, right? Like we witness movement happening. When you fire an arrow, it goes all the way to the target, not a quarter of the way, and then so on and so forth. I don't think that's a very satisfactory response to a properly well-reasoned argument. So I think you have to go a little bit farther. I know Aristotle suggested that we have to divide the time as well as the distance. So if we divide the distance by half, then we also have to divide the time taken by half. And thus the time and the distance end up canceling each other out as you divide them more and more.
Well, it's really, I don't know exactly how to prove it exactly, but
well, and so in calculus you can say infinite sums have finite totals, right?
Okay, so in calculus, whenever you're doing an infinite sum, or you're doing an infinite series like this, there are two things that it could possibly do. The first thing it could do is that it converges to a number. And the other possible thing it could do is that it just keeps getting larger and larger infinitely. So if we think of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 and so on, we call that a divergent series because it diverges from any number. It shoots off towards infinity. And if you look what happens as the series gets very long, what happens is it just tends towards a very large number, is more technically how we would say that. What's happening whenever you're adding 1 plus a quarter plus an eighth, you're adding a smaller and smaller bit each time. By the time you get to infinity, you're not adding anything extra to it. So in the last podcast, I gave you some thought experiments that demonstrated why you could think of space as being curved whenever you're in a gravity well. And I also gave you an experiment where you could imagine that falling in a gravity well is the same as floating in free space, essentially. This thought experiment is a thought experiment to convince you that heavy objects and light objects fall at the same rate. So the story goes, if I have 3 bricks, they're the same shape, made out of the same material, the same size, and we have them, say, 3 feet off the ground, will they fall and hit the ground at the same time?
Yes.
Of course they will, because they're all the same. Right. And if I translate them to the side a little bit and drop them, they fall at the same rate, because I'm still 3 feet above. So translation shouldn't matter. So they're all the same weight. But what if I translate these 2 bricks right next to each other and I keep this brick over by itself? All I've done is translate these bricks a little bit closer. But when I release them, they're all going to fall at the same rate.
Yeah.
But these 2 bricks over here, I could tape them together. They're actually 1 brick that weigh twice as much as this brick.
Right.
But they still fall at the same rate. And that's the argument. Or
Yeah.
thought experiment, rather.
Most people might even get this intuitively if you take like a really heavy object and a light object and you just like tied a string between them. It's not like the heavy object's going to fall and pull down the small object. I think the tricky part of this comes with air resistance, and that's where the intuitions get confused, because like a feather falls incredibly slowly.
Really slowly, right.
Although if you've ever watched someone drop a feather in a vacuum, it falls just like a rock, which is pretty interesting to see.
I mean, we have video of us on the moon doing this experiment with a feather and a hammer.
Yeah, and it's pretty neat.
They fall right at the same rate, both at the ground at the same time. And you can hear the astronauts, they're like, even though they clearly knew that they were both going to hit at the same time, you could still see that they're like, wow, it does. Like, physics works, it turns out.
Yeah.
Well,
that's the thing about scientific theories. We have our theory of gravity and how we understand it, and we can test it 100, 1,000 times, but we can never be completely certain. So when you get more evidence in a different environment like that, it's exciting. It's like, yay. It's nice. We didn't get this horribly wrong. Other things like friction, and there are some other outside forces too that can throw wrenches into that. But the basic principles, it makes a lot of sense. And I think the idea of taping it or tying strings, it does a really good job of demonstrating like how you can possibly even consider different objects separate and heavier or like falling faster.
Right. Because from their perspective, they're not even falling.
Well, yeah.
No matter how heavy or light you are.
And that was Galileo. So before, when you had people like Aristotle, I think they would typically predict that the heavier things did fall.
I feel like I think Aristotle's a really smart guy, and Plato and all that, and I feel like if they thought a heavy object fell more than a light object, why wouldn't they test that?
I mean, they didn't do science and experiments. People like they just talked. They talked with the people on the street, and they would argue about it. They didn't think to do that sort of thing.
Well, I know the Greek philosophical way was definitely very teleological. You describe things as wanting, so heat wants to rise. That's why it rises.
Well, yeah, he described it as the elements. So like earth wants to come to the earth, and fire wants to rise. Yeah.
Right. It's so interesting to me.
Yeah.
I would think, because Aristotle did say a lot of very smart things.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the things that's easily testable.
Well, sort of.
You can go pick up like a heavy rock and a rock that weighs approximately half of that and drop them at the same time, and you can see for yourself.
It's sort of possible, but if you think about this, if you don't understand things like we do with gravity and air resistance and so on and so forth, he might have done this experiment. He might have taken like a wooden plate and a helmet and dropped them at the same time, and maybe the helmet hit the ground a little bit faster. And so, when you don't really understand and you don't have like the scientific method to do repeated and controlled studies and experiments,
it's hard to figure out what you don't know.
Yeah. So it's I mean, He probably took a feather, right? He took a feather and a rock and dropped them, and saw the rock hit faster. So it's like, hmm.
Well, I mean, that's pretty convincing.
Yeah.
Like, experimentally.
Right, yeah. So it is tricky to experiment just because of all those other factors. So I forgive him. But this next one is one, it's pretty tricky. I know it's one that you are more familiar with than I, so how about you just go for it.
So this is a philosophical thought experiment, one made by Plato. He says, imagine there's a group of people who are in a cave. They're imprisoned in the cave, and they've been there since birth. And they have their backs against a wall, and then the cave entrance is behind them. And then what they see in front of them is the shadows of the people walking, and the shadow of the dogs and chariots and the various things that can move past a cave. And the people inside the cave will make stories about these shadows, and they will develop names for them, and they can make their own quote unquote culture around like what they see. And not only are they seeing the shadows, they're hearing the echoes of those things coming through. And so they have this reality given to them. And we imagine one day one of the prisoners escapes, and he goes out into the world, and at first it's really bright because you've been in a cave your whole life, you go from a dark place to a bright place. And at first he only notices the shadows of the trees and the shadows of the chariots cast on the ground because everything is too bright. And he knows that's real. As his eyes adjust, though, he starts to see these higher forms. He starts to see, oh, that's what the chariot is. And he starts to see, oh, that's what a dog is, and that's what a cat. And then what he finally ends up realizing is that the sun is ultimately lighting everything. And the true form isn't the shadow of it. The shadow is just a crude representation of its actual form. And so with this newfound knowledge of what things actually are in their actual forms, the excited freed man goes back to enlighten everybody back in the cave. And as he goes back inside, his eyes have adjusted to seeing the light. And he's stumbling along, trying to get back because it's really dark. They're really back in that cave. And he gets back to them. What the prisoners in the cave see is that when you left the cave, it messed up your eyes and you can't see properly anymore. Whenever he tries to tell the stories of, no, there's a light out there, and it's only what we see, these shadows, these aren't the true form. He would just get laughed at and be told, you're crazy. You obviously can't see the shadows right now. Something happened to you. Like, we can't trust you. And what Plato is saying is the man who went out into the cave is the philosopher. The people in the cave are humans before we had philosophy. We're living in a dark cave with the cave is our sensory, analogous to our sensory experiments. It's all we can know. But outside of our sensory experiments, outside of the cave, is the true form of all the objects. And the sun that brings down the light onto the true form, that is the light of logic, and that's the light of reason. And whenever you use this logic and reason, whenever you use your logos, you can figure out the true nature of reality. And once you do, the people who didn't try to see will call you a fool, even though you do know more than what they do.
So that's a whole lot to unpack. The first thing I think about is recently I've been reading Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche. And one of his primary claims, as far as I can tell, is that there are no facts. There are only interpretations. In the book, he denies Kant, he denies Hume, he denies every school of philosophy, and says that they're all just interpretations. None of them are factual. And that's sort of where my mind immediately goes when thinking about this sort of thing, because it's the same idea of there is no external reality necessarily that we can experience, but we can only ever see the shadows, so to speak. We can get different perspectives.
We can only ever see an incomplete picture of what's actually there. just by the nature of us not being infinite beings.
It ties in a bit to the idea that there might be more dimensions out there, you know. You
Mm-hmm.
could look at the cave as our 3D world, and you could look at the outside of the cave as the additional dimension space
Right.
dimensions that we can see the shadows of, but we can't see the actual reality.
Exactly. Right. And I like this thought experiment a lot because it does translate to, it really points to that idea that, how do you say this? We Being blind is like the default situation almost, right? You don't have to know true reality in order to like get through it.
No, and
You just have to know enough about it.
I've seen arguments that we're built in ways to get reality wrong in a very specific ways.
Right, exactly. Cuz if your goal is to just simply survive and your goal is to reproduce, that doesn't the goal of making sure you understand true reality doesn't necessarily like I'll have to align with that.
Yeah, when we were on the plains of Africa hunting for food, the people who stopped to try to figure out what atoms were got eaten by lions.
Exactly. Exactly. But the people who do try and go and learn and spend their time out there, it's you're once you've figured out a truth, you're burdened with it from now on.
Now, I think there are certain misleading sort of ideas you can get from a story like this. Some people might be inspired by a story like this to sort of justify any sort of experience or belief they might hold. Because, like, oh, well, I went out of the cave and I know this thing, and everyone else, they're still inside the cave and they just don't get it. I think that can be a
Right.
pitfall potentially. But it's tricky because there's also a truth in that. So it's
There is a truth. That's why it's such a good thought experiment, I
right.
think. Because it still provokes thought.
So how about you tell me what you think? So what's the difference between someone like Newton, who went out of the cave and saw more of reality and then brought it back to the people in the cave, versus someone who thinks the Holocaust never happened and that they went out of the cave and they saw that fact and no one else inside the cave is accepting it?
So in the analogy, the sunlight that illuminates all things is the light of reason and logic. I would say the people who deny the Holocaust aren't using proper reason.
I see. So the logos is the sun, and the important thing is to always recognize that as being the light.
Yeah, what you experience, like your sensory experience, won't get you anywhere. It'll just get you shadows of true forms. What reason and logic will do, it will illuminate, it will lead you to the path to to find the true nature of things.
There's a lot in this story, honestly, and it ties into so many other stories I've heard. So in Buddhism, you have a story of a guy who gets hit by a poison arrow, and they rush him to the doctor. But the guy who's like dying poison, he's like, "Oh, who fletched this arrow? How long is it? What color is it?" And kept asking millions and millions of questions about it. And he wouldn't let the doctor operate on him until he knew everything. And the guy ends up dying because he wouldn't just let the doctor take care of him without needing to know all of the details. So I think this is actually an example where the man with the arrow in him might think he's the one outside of the cave because he's trying to get all the knowledge, but the doctor is the one who's actually journeyed outside the cave so that he can come back with the knowledge to help this guy.
And the one still stuck in the cave cannot trust the doctor because it hasn't seen the true
Right.
it hasn't seen the true form of it.
Yeah,
and it's just like it's not part of his reality. Like the people in the cave, their reality is seeing shadows and figures and stuff. Like they've never seen the true form because they've never been illuminated by the logos.
yeah. Wow, that's a there's so much to pull out of that story. You could probably write a book about that story.
He used this as an argument for an anti-democracy argument. He said the people shouldn't rule themselves because they're the ones stuck in the caves, and society should be ruled by philosophical kings. Was basically his conclusion. Society should be ruled by those who have come out of the cave, essentially. Right?
Would you subscribe to a belief like that? Do you think we should be ruled by kings who are good philosophers?
That makes sense to me. I don't know if I don't know. It's hard to say. It's I mean, democracy seems kind of cool to me. I like having part of the say.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know.
Well,
That's a yeah.
yeah. Well, either way, there's a lot you can pull out of that idea, and it's pretty cool. So next we have the experience machine. It's also called the pleasure machine. It's a philosophical idea where you have this machine that can simulate reality in any way. You can have any experience you want, as pleasurable as you want, anything that is possible that your brain can experience, you can do that. So if you want to live a fulfilling life as a king in ancient Greece, or if you want to be a daily skydiver, eat ice cream for every meal, anything you can possibly think of, you get to experience that. Would you, and I'll just ask you, Tyler, would you plug in to that machine?
I feel like I would. A machine to experience anything?
To add the other piece, you have to live out the rest of your life in the machine.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Would you trade this life for one of any experience you desire?
I don't know. I'm conflicted. On one hand, I feel like it's sort of up to me to create an experience for myself that is desirable. And so that part of me would say that plugging into the machine would take away from my, I don't know, hard work of.
I mean, would you make the case that a good experience is only good if it was difficult to achieve, or it's somehow enhanced by it being difficult?
No, because you can have a good experience that's just simply.
Is a roller coaster
I know,
better if you have
so-
to wait in line a long time to ride it?
No, I don't think so. Well, there is something to be said about working something out versus having it given to you.
Well, sure, but even that's sort of a matter of experience, and hypothetically, you could have that sort of experience in this machine.
I don't know if I would plug into it because I don't know what kind of experience I want to have.
Well, let's. There are a couple ways to present this experiment, so let me just adjust it to fix it for you. So let's say that we have psychologists who are watching you and analyzing, and they use the information they get to induce the most pleasurable, fulfilling experiences they could possibly do for you that you could not distinguish from reality.
Until I die?
Yeah. Or maybe, would you prefer the machine to real life, I guess? This is a fundamental question.
See, that's a tricky question to me because I don't know I don't know how to distinguish the two.
To distinguish what?
Like real life. Because if I was
What's
in the
the point?
machine, it would be real life. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would feel like real life.
Right.
Depending on how you like to define real life, I don't know. But the experience would feel just as real as this.
It would definitely. Right, exactly. It would certainly seem like that's what was happening.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think continuous pleasure is equal to good.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's sort of the argument. So you have the first premise is if experiencing pleasure is all that matters, you should do things that give you more pleasure.
Then you should plug into the machine.
Yeah, well, two is if you know you're going to experience more pleasure in the machine, then you do not experience in the machine. Then the conclusion is you should plug into it. So you would be rejecting, I guess, the first premise that we shouldn't do everything that gives us pleasure without consequence.
It seems to me like if everything's pleasurable, then like it doesn't matter as much. It doesn't mean much.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying, and I think we probably more or less agree. I think meaning's really important. You can chase pleasure all you want, but in the real world, pleasure doesn't stick around and terrible things happen. And when those terrible things happen, you want to have meaning to hang on to sustain you through there. But it's tricky for me because if you're in this world, the simulated reality, outside of external factors, so I could think of external objections for myself. So, for example, I wouldn't plug into it because I'd be concerned about the bad things that would happen for my wife and my family and my friends and those who care about me. Like, I want to be there for those people. But let's say that I'm just like, I'm 120, everyone I've ever known has died, and I have no other external factors to limit me. I could see myself plugging into the machine because why do you even need meaning when you don't have anything bad that ever happens?
So meaning to me is like doing the right thing at the right time. If you do the right thing at the right time and you know it's the right thing at the right time, you will perceive that as a meaningful.
Well, so the tricky part now here is, what do you mean by right thing?
What so whatever you stipulate as right.
What do you stipulate as right?
I mean, a lot of the things I do, like whenever you're doing the right thing at the right time, you can realize it by noticing how the passage of time seems to disappear. How you're just kind of lost in the act of whatever you're doing.
Well, isn't this machine like the pinnacle of that? You could be indefinitely lost in the moment.
So if it was a machine that just put you in that flow state, I'm not quite sure what it is, where you're just like
you're like
you're
one
engaged
with all of consciousness. Like you
Right.
are the experience.
Right. That seems like a pretty hard thing to turn down. But that to me sounds slightly different than saying it just like gives me unlimited pleasure.
Well, what's the difference? Like, how would you distinguish pleasure from that? Because if that,
Because well, when I'm in the right place at the right time doing what I need to be doing and I'm doing it correctly, there's not a sense of like pleasure there. There's not a sense of angst. It's just you're just in the flow.
yeah.
Just in the moment.
No,
right?
I understand what you like. You can be in a horrible circumstance and obtain that sort of.
Right. So that specific state that I'm talking about, so that doesn't happen all the time. I think you should try and maximize. You should do everything you could to try and find that place. But when you're in that place, like when it's happening, it's not pleasurable. It's meaningful. And so that's kind of how I separate.
Well, if I stretch the definition of pleasure to include that sort of experience, so like we could use a word like well-being, for example, and I think well-being probably would encompass both pleasure and this sort of self-transcendence that you're describing. So,
Well,
would you
so
then plug into
whenever-
the machine?
Probably. I don't see why not.
But what were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna say whenever you're practicing guitar or something, and you're like you're learning a piece that's pretty difficult. Not it's pushing you a little bit, but you're learning it at a rate which you find acceptable, and over the course of the few hours where you're engaged in this activity and you're doing it and you're internalizing everything that's happening and you're going through the motion or whatnot, when you look up at the clock and you're like, oh wow, I've been practicing for 2.5 hours, like 3 hours or whatnot. During that time, I don't think you will be thinking of things like the rest of the universe from your perspective has disappeared, and you're just in this place of optimal flow. If the experience machine put me in this state of just optimal flow from now and for always, it would be over in an instant.
I would like to think that there are many conceptions of pleasure that sort of fit that idea. Well-being is probably a better word to use.
I don't like pleasure because I do things for pleasure,
Yeah.
like
Now, I get why you don't.
the things I do for meaning
Yeah.
are not pleasurable sometimes.
Right. Yeah. That's understandable. I think pleasure is a bad word for that reason because it has that connotation of.
But that's what this whole thought experiment's getting to, right? Is that an experience that gives us nothing but pleasure, there's good reasons to not plug into that experience machine.
Yeah. The reasons the original guy who presented this thought experiment to not plug in were that we want to do certain things and not have the experience of doing them. We want to be a certain sort of person, not someone floating in a tank. And plugging into an experience machine limits us to a man-made reality. So like we're limited by what we can make. So we won't have contact with any deeper reality, if you will, to
So that
yeah.
Yeah, so that third point, plugging into a man-made reality, that was whenever I said I don't think I would plug into it because I don't know what I would I choose what I could experience, or does it just like read my mind and then says, oh, if you were experiencing this, that would maximize pleasure?
Well, I think in the original thought experiments, it's like it's psychologists and neuroscientists. So I think the idea is like we've studied different brain states and we've had people report to us how they feel at certain brain states, and we find like the brain states where people like the most, basically, and you experience those brain states forever.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, I don't know how strong of an argument this, but you can't enjoy a vacation, I feel, if you haven't worked hard before the vacation. In the same way that like you can't experience true pleasure unless you've experienced truly terrible things, right?
I don't think that's true, but
There's there's a level of you won't understand truly what pleasure is if that's all you've ever experienced it, because you have nothing to compare it to.
you wouldn't appreciate the pleasure as much as someone who has suffered immensely, but you still could appreciate it from a point of neutrality.
I feel like whatever appreciation you give to it will be severely lacking when compared to the appreciation that the person who has experienced.
Yeah, if you look at experiences like a plane, you can imagine like a valley being looking up at a really tall hill and seeing how amazing that is. But you could also imagine being on a flat, neutral, non-suffering plane and going up a hill and being happy about that. I think. I think you're right that you might not have as deep of an appreciation as someone who's been through suffering, but you could still have.
Right. I think trying to maximize that appreciation, I think, would be a good thing. And if plugging into the machine limits, it seems like plugging into the machine would limit the possible amount of appreciation I could have.
Hmm.
I would have nothing to compare the good experience to. It would just be a continual good experience. And what kind of experience is that?
Yeah.
That seems kind of boring to me.
No, I basically agree. Although
Like,
I could see myself at
I
a very old age, just like, we're just gonna ride this to the end.
I don't like bad experience, and
Right.
I tend to do everything I can to avoid it. But like, never experience suffering ever. There's a lot you'd miss out. Like, there's so much you can learn
All
from
that
having
great
a bad
suffering.
experience. Right. Like, truly great
I
suffering.
don't know. I don't know if I completely buy into that. I do understand that like you can learn from suffering and that it brings meaning, but if there is no suffering, I don't know how much need there is for meaning. Do you think the idea of heaven is bad?
Yeah.
So like given the
Because
choice,
I think it takes away from what we're doing here and now.
well, so but you think not like as a philosophical concept, but like do you think the concept like if you had a choice at the end of your life and you at the very end you could be like, okay, I can either call it quits now or I
I
can go
think
to this.
you should strive to make the world around you as close to heaven as you can make it.
Mhm. That would
But if
include
you
no
were just
suffering, right? Or unless you were.
right, I mean, by any definition of heaven, there would be no suffering in there, right?
I've heard some people say that heaven should have suffering. Um, I think that's
Well, that would be an
unusual claim,
interesting
but
argument. Heaven should. So, whenever I think of heaven and hell, I think heaven and hell literally exist in the sense that whenever whenever you're in that flow state that I was describing earlier, whenever you're doing what you should be doing, when you should be doing it, by whatever standard you chose, that is essentially heaven. Like, you're in a place where time doesn't seem to matter. Time just disappears. In fact, everything else that you could possibly know is just not relevant at the time when you're in this place. And I think hell exists in this exact same way that like whenever you're like you've lost your job, your parents kicked you out of the house, you just got divorced, your wife took all the kids, and your car broke down and you've just gotten debt and just keep piling on the list. I think that's hell. Like literally that's hell.
I don't know. I don't know if that's the appropriate use of the word literally, but
That's what I think.
yeah, those are atypical definitions of heaven and hell.
Right. Normally people think of like other places, but in like my mind, you are in other places. Like when you're in that flow state, you are in this like boxed off universe where there is nothing else and you're just like you're in that spot. And whenever you're in hell, whenever you're in that horrible spot where just life is against you and everything, you're in a different place. You occupy the same earth that you did whenever you were 3 weeks ago in this flow state, and now you're in the same like physical location, but you're in separate realities. Like that's what I think.
So well. You don't literally think you're in separate realities, but you're talking about this as a matter of experience, right? You're saying that hell is an experience and
Well,
heaven is an
I mean,
experience, or no? Are you making a different claim?
yes, you can experience heaven and hell here on earth. That's what I think.
Right. So just to clarify, but you think the conception of a place that people go after they die, where there is no suffering at all,
Right.
you would think that that would be a less desirable world than the one we live in?
I don't know if it'd be less desirable.
Like if you had to pick to live in one of those for eternity?
If so, in a world where we die and just turn into our constituent atoms versus a world where we die and our spirit transcends to a different plane of existence.
where you experience pleasure, no suffering, and whatever meaning can be had without suffering, so to speak.
That'd be quite the place to go to.
So,
Seems like.
so then suffering isn't a necessary component of existence, you think?
No, I don't think so. Suffering isn't a necessary component of existence. I don't think, but neither is pleasure. I don't. To exist, you like existing is far separate than just pleasure or something like that.
Well, like I'm talking about like desirable existence, I guess. Like, would you choose an existence without? Well, that's what I'm really asking is, would you choose an existence without suffering, knowing whatever consequences that might bring?
I don't know. I don't know what that existence would be like. Like,
Yeah.
would that be a meaningful like existence?
I think so. You see, I think we can have meaningful experience without suffering, and I think by and large suffering is just a bad thing, even though we can extract a great deal of utility and meaning out of suffering.
Well, okay. So yeah, I see what you're saying. I do think suffering is what happens by default if you don't do anything.
Yeah.
So in that sense, suffering is default. Like if you don't do anything, that's the wind and the dirt and all the forces around you are trying to continually tear you apart.
Oh,
Entropy is always trying to increase.
even without going that far, just talking only in terms of experience, like in prison, how they punish people is they put them in solitary confinement by themselves
Yeah.
with only their thoughts.
The worst punishment in prison is solitary confinement for months on end.
And that tells you a lot.
That does tell you a lot.
Our minds are amazing at tormenting us.
Right. And I do think that is in general the default position of, at least for our existence as humans.
Yeah.
And so like a world where the idea of suffering literally doesn't exist and those claws aren't constantly trying to pull you down. It's hard for me. It's as hard for me to imagine that world as it is for me to imagine 4 or 5 dimensions. Like I don't have an intuit for that. I feel like I live in a world with 3 dimensions, and it also feels like a world where suffering is just the default condition that's always trying to drag everything down.
Right. But of course, we might just be looking at all the shadows.
Right. That is true. But I mean, these are conclusions that I would like to think I've used reason to get to.
Yeah.
And introspection.
No, yeah, of course. Oh, no, I wasn't trying to... I was just saying that it's more reason to not go into the machine because of the third point, I guess, of not being in contact with deeper reality.
Right, exactly. There's something about like those grasping claws that are deeper reality.
Like what we might be missing,
Right, we wouldn't even know what we'd be missing. And then in that case, like ignorance is bliss, right? And then you're just living in bliss forever. And
Yeah.
I don't think anybody agrees that like living in bliss is the best way to live, right?
What? Well,
Even though we see those people, they seem to be having a great time. They seem to be loving life, and they're ignorant of all the bad and terrible things. Like, not. What's interesting is people don't tend to be like, "Oh, I want to be that person. I want to be the ignorant person who's living in bliss." We want to know stuff, right? Even if it like.
I think it's hard to say, honestly. I feel often that I'm cursed to not be able to do that. It feels like a burden that I have this desire to just know things, whether they're nice or not.
I mean, going a little bit back to, you mentioned heaven and hell earlier. Like this is like Adam and Eve eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, right? We are now cursed with knowledge that good and evil exists now. Like before in the garden, you just live blissfully, like no knowledge of good or evil, but like as soon as they ate that fruit, like you just
It's sort of
we
implied that that's a better existence. Just
right
even by how
exactly
you and I are talking about it.
right
Seems we
right
both tacitly acknowledge it would be a better life.
right in the garden or outside the garden.
Inside the garden. Or do you not think so? I mean, we're using this language cursed and burden. Like that makes it sound like
Right.
it would be better if we were ignorant and just happy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. But what's interesting is since we do have knowledge of good and evil,
Right.
like
We are cursed, and now we have to figure out what to deal with it. That's the real problem.
yeah, like like whenever you know evil exists in the world, it's a whole different like it's a different thing
Yeah.
than just living.
Yeah, of course.
Like a bear has no knowledge of good and evil. But if it did have knowledge of good and evil, it might feel bad when it tears apart the salmon, right? It might judge that like as evil or something.
Yeah.
And that's right. Knowledge of good and evil is really really quite unique.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's all we have time for. We should. That will be
At least for this week.
Yeah. And we won't be here next week. We're going to be on vacation in New York, and hopefully we'll come back with some nice stories. Thank you guys for listening. Sorry we got off on a little tangent. Hope you let us know if you enjoyed that or if we should stick to the books better.
Yeah.
I had fun. That was a interesting line of
I enjoyed
thought,
it
for
as
sure.
well.
All right. Well,
Until next time.
yeah, we'll see you guys.